everyone, today I'm going to be wrapping up everything that I read in April. So little mini reviews of all of the books that I got through in the month. And let me tell you, April was probably the weirdest reading month I've ever had. I took part in the Newts this month and I didn't do as well as I wanted to, and I'm going to do a full video talking about how I failed the Newts. I did read 16 books, so you might be like, why didn't you just read the books that you were meant to for your Newts? Well, I planned on doing that. 16 books is a great amount of books to read in a month and something that I would normally be really happy with, but I did read 10 very short books in one day, and if you've not seen that reading vlog, I will link it down below in the description if you want to check it out. But that does mean that for the other 29 days of April, I only read 6 books, which isn't something that I'm thrilled about, but I'm trying to treat myself with kindness, especially at this very weird time. I think for basically the last 2 weeks of April, I didn't really read anything apart from like the last couple days. So books I had planned to read for my owls, that I'd planned to read in the second 2 weeks of the month, I just didn't read. But I'll talk about that more when I talk about my owls in a different video. In saying all of that, I did read a lot of great books, and I am going to kick off this wrap up with 2 books that I absolutely loved more than the others in April. The first of those is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This was the last book that I read in the month, and it is a book that has massively pulled me out of a weird reading slump, reading funk. This book is so good. So this book is about Dana, who is a writer in the 1970s, but she finds herself transported back in time to the early 1800s, where she is assumed to be a slave. She finds herself on a plantation in Maryland, and she flips between her present day and 1815 on this plantation, and gradually she discovers that the thing that is taking her into the past is that she has to protect a young boy and eventually a young man who is actually one of her ancestors. So even though this boy isn't very nice, to put it mildly, I mean, he is like the child of a slave owner and eventually a slave owner, she has to protect him, even though like morally she's very against a lot of the things that she ends up having to defend. I'm not even entirely sure how to properly put into words how powerful this novel is, but also what a page turner it is. You are so desperate to find out what happens to Dana. At one point, her husband, who is white, ends up transported back in time with her, but doesn't get transported back to the 1970s when she returns, and he is stuck there. And I thought it was really interesting to consider what he chooses to do and not do while he's at the plantation, because obviously he has a lot more structural power than her, and there are things that he could morally stand up for, but if he does that then make them suspicious? I don't think any review I do of this book will do it justice, but I don't really give books star ratings, but this one was a 5-star book. Like, it's so incredible. Quite a shift in tone. My other favourite read of April was The Switch by Beth O'Leary. Beth O'Leary is quite well known for her previous novel, The Flat Share, which I haven't read yet, but after reading this book, I am so desperate to read The Flat Share, because the premise of that book appeals to me a lot more than this one, and I loved this one. The Switch is about a young woman who has a really successful career in London, but she's really suffering from burnout. Her boss says it's time for her to take some time out, that everything will be fine while she's gone, but she needs some time to rest. And Lena, who is this young woman, decides that she will go and visit her grandmother Eileen, who lives in quite a quaint English village. And then they decide that they should just swap lives. So Lena will stay in the quaint English village, take over all of the village responsibilities that Eileen has, and Eileen will go down to London, stay with Lena's flatmates, and start dating. I just loved that so much, and I thought it was so great to see an older person, like, seeing them dating, seeing them have like a flourishing sex life, as well as seeing Lena focus in on what really matters to her and what she values and what in her life was superficial and what was actually important. While some of the romance plots in this book are really fun, what is so captivating about this book is the relationships and bonds between women of different generations. Of course, we have Lena and Eileen learning lots from each other, but in the middle of those, we do have Lena's mother, and their relationship is very strained because they've never really communicated about the grief that they share following the death of Lena's sister. I read this one at the start of the month, and it was so great that a slightly dodgy reading month was bookended by two fantastic reads. Very different in tone and subject matter, although both are kind of about like generations of women and the relationships between those women and what those women can learn from each other. While we're on the adult fiction, we may as well stick with it. I also read Liberty by V.J. Spencer. This is a self-published crime book, and for full disclosure, I do know the author of this book. This book begins with a woman realizing that her husband hasn't come home and he's not in the bed next to her. When she goes to investigate this, she finds out that he is dead in their garden. The novel then flicks back and we follow the lead up to that event, looking at things from her perspective, her husband's perspective, but there are also some other characters as well. There are a pair of brothers that are somehow involved in this crime, and we also delve into their past and discover quite how messy their relationship is. One of the things I really loved about this book was how genuine the characters felt. Like, I really believed them as people. I thought the pacing of the story was really strong. I thought the atmosphere and setting was done really well. There are also a lot of really visceral scenes in this book, and they are depicted really, really powerfully, but huge trigger warnings for graphic violence and sexual assault, for emotional abuse. The book is such a page turner. The author has managed to end every chapter absolutely perfectly that makes you want to read on to the next one. I don't read any self-published fiction. I'm someone who's very much like a believer in traditional publishing, but I think reading this changed my opinion on it slightly. Do I think there were some kinks in the story and the writing? Do I think it would have benefited from having an editor? Yes. Can I tell that it's a debut? Yes. Was it a brilliant story? Yes. And I wonder how many stories I'm depriving myself of that I could love because I don't really read self-published books. I'm not someone that reads a whole bunch of crime either, and I'm really difficult to please within the sort of crime and thriller genre. It's not a very long book at all, which I also really appreciated. I think it was a really fantastic crime debut, and if you're into that genre, you would probably like it even more than I would because you would actually appreciate it properly. I did read this one digitally, but I have ordered a physical copy and I'm so excited to have it on my shelf. I also read The Harpy by Megan Hunter. This is one that I grabbed from work before we left the office, and it comes out on the 11th of June of this year. I had read Megan's previous book, The End We Start From, and I really loved it, so I was so excited going into this book, and it did not disappoint. This book follows the relationship between Jake and Lucy and what happens in the aftermath of Lucy discovering that Jake has been having an affair with an older woman. One of the things I found really interesting about seeing Lucy grapple with the aftermath of this is a quite big factor for her is the fact that the woman is older. It's almost as if she could explain the situation to herself if her husband wanted to get a younger model. But the fact that she's an older woman is all the more confusing for Lucy. This couple decides that rather than ending the relationship, Lucy gets her own back by being able to hurt Jake 3 times. In many ways, this book feels like it has this otherworldly or fairy tale quality to it, but it's not. Oh my god, I've got really bad hay fever. It's really haunting and terrifying to see what Lucy pushes herself to do in order to get revenge. And because she's been hurt so badly, you do understand why she wants to do these terrible things to Jake. The writing is just razor sharp. That's a pun. Another one that is really brief but packs so much into it, and that's one of my favourite kind of books. One book that was quite short but I didn't feel packed any punch whatsoever was Sarah by J.T. Leroy. Now, I read this at the end of my 10 books in a day vlog, and I for a long time was wondering whether I did the book a misjustice by not focusing it enough in that reading vlog. And I actually just think it wasn't very good. So this book follows a character named Cherry Vanilla, who I initially thought was a girl. They are a boy who dresses up as a girl, and they have aspirations of following in their mother's footsteps and becoming the world's most famous lot lizard. I didn't know what a lot lizard was. It's a sex worker that works in like truck shops. I didn't get this book. I didn't think it was very good. I don't know what the author was trying to say at any point. I didn't get the point of it. Nothing really happens in this book apart from this child doing a job that they really shouldn't be doing. There's a lot of kind of conspiracy and mythology around the writing of this book, and I did look into it a little bit. JT Leroy is not a real person. It's like this persona created by another writer who then got her sister-in-law to perform as JT Leroy in public appearances. I just found it really weird. I wouldn't recommend this book. I don't think it's very good. I also read You People by Nikita Lavani. This was a really surprising book for me. I kind of went into this book with no expectations. I requested it off NetGalley without knowing too much about it, and it was such a really great book. This book is centered around a Italian pizzeria in London. Half of the people that work there are Sri Lankan, half of the people that work there are illegal immigrants. The owner of this business is a guy named Thule, who is kind of like a Robin Hood figure and really helps out all of the immigrants get onto their feet with advice and practical help, but also financially. And it's a real mystery in this book where all of Thule's money comes from. The book is mainly focused on two characters, 19-year-old Nina, who is trying to flee from her past. She's from Wales originally. And we learn more and more about her history as the book goes on. And Sean, who has fled from the Sri Lankan civil war and wants to build a life in the UK, hoping that his wife and daughter will be able to follow. While I've always been very supportive of freedom of movement and think we should allow refugees in and allow people to immigrate, I'd never really thought much about the day-to-day life of people who are illegal immigrants. It's something that my privilege blinded me from really thinking about. Things like if you are injured, you can't go to the hospital. Not only did this book show me the breadth of different experiences that there are for people in these situations, but the mystery of who Thule is, the extent of his operations, is a mystery that really keeps you going throughout this book. If there are topics that you would be interested in, then I really recommend this novel. I think it's kind of slipped under people's radars a little bit, and I would just really highly recommend it. I also read Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson. I had read one of her YA books before, so I had relatively high hopes for this one, and it did not disappoint. This book opens in 2001 on the eve of Melody's coming of age celebration when she is 16. We take a look at her life, but also generations of her family's life in what is a very short book. It kind of reminded me of like a reverse Homegoing by Ya Jessie. Obviously a very different premise, but being able to squeeze so many point of views into such a short book and it still be really powerful and impressive, and you get a real sense of who all these characters are. This book is about gentrification and class and prejudice. It is about ambition and desire. It's about how when we're young we don't really realise the decisions that older generations had to make at our age. When I look back at my reading month, I try and figure out if there was any sort of theme, anything that united some of the books that I read. And sometimes I feel like I'm slightly clutching at straws, but I think a real theme for this month, and it wasn't something I planned, it's never something I really plan, was like intergenerational relationships. I also read a poetry collection. This is Legion by David Harsand. I would say I am the problem, not this book, because I really didn't get on with it. But I don't think I really devoted enough attention to it, and this is war poetry, and I'm not really into war poetry at all. It was very focused on imagery as well, and if I am going to be interested in war poetry, I'm more interested in the emotions rather than the imagery. I'm sure if you're into war poetry, then you would get a lot more out of this than I did, but this collection just wasn't for me. Another poetry collection I read was Fire by Jackie Kay. I'd read quite a bit of Jackie Kay in the past, so I was really excited to read this book, and I loved this poetry collection just as much as I loved all of her other books. This collection mainly focuses on Jackie Kay's experiences of having Nigerian heritage but having been adopted by Scottish parents in the Highlands. The intersections of all the different identities she has, how those identities blend into her one self. I loved that a lot of these poems were written in Scots or some form of Scots dialect. It really gives a sense of scene and character that I really appreciated. This poetry collection does go alongside her memoir, Red Dust Road, which I do have on my shelf, so I'm hoping to pick up that one soon, so this one is fresh in my mind when I'm reading that. I also read a short story collection. This is Treats by Lara Williams. I read her novel The Supper Club earlier this year, and I really loved it, so I had high expectations for this collection, especially because I'd heard a lot of good things about it as well, and it really surpassed my expectations. I think this is probably one of my favourite short story collections of all time. And I'm really difficult to please with short stories. I think a lot of people feel the same way in that they can be so hit and miss. You know, there are going to be stories in there that you like and some that you don't like so much. These are a collection of stories that are all about what it's like to be a 20-something-year-old in contemporary society, which, yeah, I was gonna like it. There's a lot to do in here with feeling alienated, with experiences of sexuality, relationships. Some of the stories are quite dark at points. There's a story in here that is literally only 2.5 pages called, I think, Both Boys or something like that, where a girl sleeps with 2 different guys who end up being best friends in the one night. And I just really liked it. I really felt like these stories were just a breath of fresh air. Like, I really, really loved them. I also read A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle. I love the Sherlock Holmes stories. I find them really comfortable and cozy. I feel really like they're not a huge amount of work to read because you're kind of not meant to figure out what the mystery is. In this book, we follow the first time that Dr. Watson worked with Sherlock, and we are looking at a murder that happens in South London where the body seems entirely undamaged, but the word Rache, R-A-C-H-E, is written on the wall in blood. I feel like I don't need to sell the Sherlock stories to you. I feel like you know what you're getting with a Sherlock story. Now onto some books for younger readers. I'm going to start with a picture book, and that is I Can Catch a Monster by Bethan Wolven. This is about a little girl named Bo who believes that she can catch a monster. Her older brothers are going off on an adventure to try and find a monster, and they don't let Bo come with them. So Bo sets off on her own. She's going to catch the monster by herself, but she doesn't end up finding exactly what she expected. This is a gorgeous picture book that has an art style that I absolutely adore. I think Bethan Wolven's books are really great for little girls in particular, but little boys too, to see girls being active and doing things and going on adventures. It's a story about bravery and kindness and friendship, and I would really highly recommend it if you have a young reader in your life, or like me, you are a grown-up that likes to read picture books. I also read Asha and the Spirit Bird by Jasbinder Balan. This is a story that is set in the foothills of the Himalayas. This book looks at what happens when Asha's father, who works in the city, stops sending money to her mother to support the family. A moneylender ransacks their home, and Asha's mother decides that it is time for them to leave their home and move somewhere else, and Asha desperately doesn't want this to happen, so she and her best friend go on a quest to find her father, find out what has happened, and put things right. But they encounter so much danger along the way, both from other people, but also from some of the creatures that they meet along the way when they are camping in woodlands. When eventually they find out what happened to Asha's father, it is very emotionally impactful, but I think this is a story that is filled with hope, and it's so much about bravery. I found the setting in this book incredible. It was a setting that I've never read anything about before. Really great middle grade. I'm loving my middle grade lately, so I would highly recommend this, and it's probably one of the most beautiful book covers I have ever seen. Another middle grade read I had this month was Beyond Platform 13 by Sybil Pounder and Eva Ibbotson. This is the follow-up to The Secret of Platform 13. I read that book earlier this year and I really enjoyed it. I love middle grade fantasy. In this book, the island of Mist is under siege, and Odge Gribble, who is a hag who we meet in the first book, is in the human world trying to find a mist maker expert who can help save the island of Mist. But she ends up mistaking this little girl for the mist maker, and this little girl is definitely not the mist maker. This is Lena, a 9-year-old girl in search of an adventure, and she tries to tell Odge several times that she is not whatever a mist maker is, but Odge doesn't listen, and Lena just ends up taken on this adventure. And even though she's not the mist maker, maybe she can help. I love the magic in this book. I love all of the characters. This book is genuinely, like, really funny, and there are a lot of really great set pieces in this book, really memorable scenes, and that's one of the things I think is a sign of a really great middle grade novel, is when there are those really memorable scenes. And even as a grown-up reader, there are little plot points in this book that make you go, oh, that makes sense now. It's just so carefully plotted. I thought it was really fantastically done. Another middle grade read that I would really recommend. I also read Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret by Judy Blume. Judy Blume is basically like the American equivalent of Jacqueline Wilson. She writes a lot of books about sort of preteens and teens experiencing things for the first time. I've been gradually working my way through her novels, and wow, I can really tell why this is one of the ones that is most well known, or that I'd heard about before going into these novels. So this book is of course about Margaret, who is starting a new school and trying to fit in with these new people. But it's also about all of her first experiences. Like, there's a lot in this book about girls gradually getting bras, like one by one, and like who's getting their first bra when, who's getting their first kiss, their first period, and it looks at how sometimes people lie about when those first happened to them. It was really great to see a book that depicted periods, but it was also really great to see a book that depicted masturbation. At this sort of preteen age where she doesn't really know what she's doing, she just knows that it feels nice. And it's so important to talk about that stuff so kids don't feel weird when they're doing something that's completely normal. Margaret doesn't really feel like she can confide in the other girls at her school, but there is someone that she can confide in, and that's God. And another huge plot of this book is how people kind of expect her to follow in their footsteps with regards to their religious beliefs. So some people in her family really want her to be like Christian, some people really want her to be Jewish, her parents don't really want her to be any religion at all, but Margaret does decide to pray to God, and one of the things she really prays about is her really wanting boobs, and I just found that really entertaining. Really great book. I'd wish I'd read these books when I was that kind of age group. And the final book I'm going to talk to you guys about is It Only Happens in the Movies by Holly Bourne. This is a YA book that was very much of two halves for me. The first half of the book I kind of thought was just okay. I was like, oh, I feel like if I'd read this when I was a teenager, I would have really loved it, but I'm not sure it's for me. I think that's because I was reading it in really small chunks and I wasn't properly getting into it, whereas the second half of the book I just sat down and read, and I devoured it and loved it. This is about the relationship between Audrey and Harry. Audrey has just had a breakup and she's grappling with a number of complicated feelings about that, whether she was the person at fault, whether she could have done things differently, and because of some of the stuff that happened in that relationship, she has a lot of anxiety around sex. Audrey is really passionate about movies and she decides to start working in this like kind of indie bougie movie theatre where she meets Harry, who is a couple of years older than her, but they do have this kind of connection and banter, and Audrey feels very cautious about that because he seems like just a stereotypical fuckboy. And let me tell you, their relationship was just such a roller coaster of emotions for me. I think Harry is one of the most finely crafted young men I've ever read in YA literature. Let me tell you for why. There are a number of times in this book where Harry is just a knob. Total fuckboy behaviour, really disrespectful, makes terrible decisions that upset Audrey, and justifiably so, but he's not all bad. He does do a lot of really great things for Audrey. He really, really does. There are a lot of moments in this book where he is really great for her. And I think it would have been really easy to vilify his character rather than seeing him as someone who is complicated and has his own troubles and difficulties in his life, and is also learning to navigate relationships just as much as Audrey is. And in that learning process, he messes up a lot. It would also be very easy to see him as this kind of slimy guy who doesn't clean his car and he just smokes weed all the time, and he is those things. And you're like, Audrey, man, you could do so much better than this. Like, this guy is literal trash. But when you're that age, you don't care about that stuff. When it's one of your first experiences of that kind of connection with someone, you don't really have many experiences or expectations to compare it to. We also have another plot in this story which is about the divorce between Audrey's parents and her coming to see her parents in more complex ways. And I found that really, really powerful and really well executed. Holly Bourne is just, I think, probably one of the best YA writers there's ever been. I really think that. I honestly think I could talk about this book for an entire video. Why didn't I talk about this book at the start when I was talking about my favourite books of the month? Because the more I talk about it, the more I think it's a favourite book. So that's it. They are all the books that I read in April. If you've read any of these books, do leave me a comment down below and we can have a chat about these books down in the comments. As ever, I will leave links to these books in the description, but I will also be leaving a link to Hive, which is a website where you can buy books from independent bookshops. If you do want to buy books at any point, I would really encourage you to get in touch with your independent bookshop, to use Hive, to try and support these booksellers as much as you can. Also, let me know what you're currently reading. I would love to get some recommendations from you guys, because it's not like my TBR is big enough already. I hope you're doing well, and I will talk to you in my next video.